At 3:47 a.m. on March 18, 1945, Corporal Arthur Shilstone crouched in a muddy field near the Rhine River, using a bicycle pump to inflate what looked like a 30-ton M4 Sherman tank. The tank was made of rubber and canvas, weighed 85 pounds deflated, and would be combat-ready in 20 minutes. Shilstone was 24 years old, from New York, an artist before the war who'd been drafted in 1943. He'd expected to carry a rifle. Instead, he'd been assigned to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit that didn't fight Germans with bullets. They fought them with deception. The 23rd was known unofficially as the Ghost Army. Their mission was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Make the Germans believe American forces were somewhere they weren't. Create phantom divisions with fake equipment, false radio traffic, and theatrical props. Make the enemy react to threats that didn't exist. Pull reserves toward empty fields while real American units attacked elsewhere. Shilstone and 1,100 other soldiers in the Ghost Army were actors in the largest military deception operation in American history. The inflatable tank Shilstone was working on was one of 20 being set up in this field tonight. Tomorrow morning, German reconnaissance would observe from the hills east of the Rhine. They'd see an American armored battalion, 20 tanks, support vehicles, command posts, the logistics tail of a mechanized unit preparing for operations. They'd report to their commanders. German intelligence would update their maps. German reserves might be repositioned, all based on equipment that could be deflated and packed into trucks in 2 hours. Shilstone had been inflating tanks for 18 months, since joining the 23rd in June 1943. He'd set up fake artillery batteries in England, phantom tank divisions in France, imaginary headquarters in Belgium. He'd painted dummy aircraft, constructed plywood trucks, and positioned rubber cannons. He'd helped create illusions that convinced German commanders they were facing American divisions that didn't exist. And tonight, near the Rhine, he was doing it again. The inflatable tank took shape as Shilstone pumped air into it. The rubber shell expanded. The canvas skeleton gave it structure. And within 15 minutes, what had been a collapsed bag now looked like a Sherman tank in the darkness. The details were impressive: molded rubber tracks, a canvas gun barrel reinforced with aluminum tubing, rubber turret with a commander's hatch, even fake road wheels and bogies. From 100 yards away, in daylight, the inflatable looked real. From 400 yards, the distance German observers would be scanning from, it was indistinguishable from an actual tank. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had been activated on January 20, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The unit's mission was classified at the highest levels. Personnel were recruited specifically for their backgrounds: artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, radio operators. Men who could create convincing illusions. The Army had realized that fooling the enemy was cheaper and safer than fighting them directly. One inflatable tank cost $85. One real Sherman tank cost $50,000. If inflatable tanks could make Germans believe they faced armor where none existed, the investment was worthwhile. The concept wasn't new. The British had used dummy tanks extensively in North Africa, deceiving Rommel about British strength and intentions before El Alamein. The success of British deception operations had impressed American commanders. General Patton himself had been part of a massive deception operation before D-Day, commanding a phantom army group in southeast England that convinced Germans the invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy. The 23rd Special Troops would bring similar deception capability to the European theater, providing battlefield deception at the corps and army level. Shilstone's training had been unusual. 6 weeks at Camp Forest learning not how to shoot, but how to deceive. How to set up inflatable equipment so it looked authentic from aerial reconnaissance. How to create fake radio traffic that mimicked real unit communications. How to use sound effects to simulate troop movements. How to paint camouflage that looked like the real thing from 500 feet up. The training emphasized attention to detail. German intelligence was professional, experienced, skeptical. Deception that fooled them had to be nearly perfect. The 23rd arrived in England in May 1944, trained for another month, then deployed to France in July, weeks after D-Day. Their first operation was near Brest in August 1944. The mission: make the Germans believe the 2nd Armored Division was preparing to attack Brest from the south, while the actual 2nd Armored moved north toward St. Malo. Shillstone's company set up 40 inflatable tanks, 20 rubber artillery pieces, and a fake command post. Radio operators broadcast traffic mimicking a full armored division. Sound trucks played recordings of tank engines and vehicle movements. For 3 days, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion. German reconnaissance observed the fake 2nd Armored Division. German artillery fired on inflatable positions, destroying several rubber tanks and canvas trucks. The Germans believed they were fighting real American armor. They kept reserves positioned to counter the expected attack on Brest. Meanwhile, 30 miles north, the real 2nd Armored Division attacked St. Malo against lighter opposition than expected. The Germans had been fooled. The deception had worked. The Brest operation established patterns the 23rd would repeat throughout the war. Set up at night when German observation was limited. Position equipment to look authentic from the angles Germans would observe from. Add realistic details: tire tracks, footpaths, garbage dumps, laundry hung to dry. Create the full signature of a military unit, not just the equipment, but the human presence. Radio operators would broadcast message traffic copied from real units, using authentic call signs and procedures. Sound trucks would play recordings at night, creating audio signatures of tank movements, truck convoys, and construction activity. The inflatable equipment was ingenious in its design. Sherman tanks, the most common American medium tank, came as kits: folded rubber shells, canvas frameworks, aluminum supports, tie-down straps. 2 men could inflate a tank in 20 minutes using hand pumps or motorized compressors. The tanks looked authentic from above, which mattered because German reconnaissance aircraft and observation posts were the primary threat. Ground-level deception was less critical because American lines prevented German ground patrols from getting close enough to spot the fakes. The rubber tanks had limitations. They couldn't withstand close inspection. Touch one and the illusion collapsed. The rubber was obviously not steel. They couldn't move under their own power. When positions needed to be adjusted, soldiers would partially deflate the tanks, drag them to new locations, and reinflate them. They were vulnerable to weather. High winds could blow them over, heavy rain could tear the canvas, and freezing temperatures made the rubber brittle. But within their operational parameters, they were devastatingly effective. By September 1944, the 23rd had conducted 3 major deception operations and numerous smaller ones. German intelligence had identified multiple American divisions based on Ghost Army illusions. In some cases, Germans reinforced positions against phantom threats, pulling troops from sectors where real American attacks were planned. In other cases, Germans attacked what they thought were American positions, wasting ammunition and exposing their own forces to real American artillery when observers called fire on the Germans assaulting inflatable tanks. The operation near Luxembourg in September 1944 was particularly successful. The 23rd created the illusion that 2 American infantry divisions were positioned north of the city, preparing to attack east. Radio traffic suggested 30,000 men. Inflatable equipment showed tanks, artillery, and support vehicles. Sound effects mimic construction and troop movements. German reconnaissance confirmed the presence of major American forces. German commanders diverted reserves to face the phantom threat. Meanwhile, the real attack came from the south, hitting weakly defended positions. The Germans were caught completely off balance. Shillstone participated in that operation, spending 4 days maintaining inflatable tanks, while German artillery fired sporadically at their positions. Several rubber tanks were destroyed by shell fragments. Shillstone and other soldiers would wait until dark, then replace the destroyed fakes with new inflatables. From German observation points, it looked like American tank crews were conducting maintenance and repairs on damaged vehicles. The illusion held. The risks were significant. The 23rd operated in forward areas, often within range of German artillery and patrols. If Germans overran their positions, Ghost Army soldiers were regular infantry, armed only with rifles and personal weapons. Their inflatable tanks and rubber artillery couldn't fight back. Several times, German patrols came close enough that the 23rd prepared to abandon their equipment and withdraw. But German infantry never pushed far enough to discover the deception. The illusion remained intact. The deception techniques evolved through experience. Radio operators learned to mimic not just the formats of real unit traffic, but the personalities of operators. They'd introduce small errors that real operators made, use the same abbreviations, maintain the same schedules. German radio intelligence monitored American communications extensively. Traffic that was too perfect would be suspicious. Traffic that matched real patterns, including realistic imperfections, was believable. Sound effects required careful execution. The 23rd had trucks equipped with powerful speakers and recordings of military sounds. Tank engines, truck convoys, construction equipment, even soldiers talking and shouting. Sound trucks would position at night, play recordings at realistic volumes, then move before dawn. Germans listening from their lines would hear American armor or logistics activity, confirming what their aerial reconnaissance was showing. The combination of visual and audio deception was compelling. By December 1944, the 23rd had conducted 15 major operations. They'd created phantom divisions, fake corps headquarters, imaginary logistics centers. German intelligence had been consistently fooled. But the Ghost Army's most ambitious operation was still ahead. In March 1945, the 23rd would help deceive Germans about where American forces would cross the Rhine. The Rhine crossing was the most significant American operation of spring 1945. The river was the last major natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. Germans knew Americans would cross. The question was where. Multiple crossing sites were possible. Germans had to defend all of them, but their reserves were limited. If Americans could make Germans believe the main crossing would occur at one location while actually crossing elsewhere, the deception could save thousands of American lives. Operation Viersen was the Ghost Army's contribution. Starting March 18th, the 23rd would create the illusion that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were concentrating near Viersen, 10 miles north of the actual crossing site. Radio traffic, inflatable equipment, sound effects, and visual presence would convince Germans that 30,000 American soldiers were preparing to cross at Viersen. German reserves would move north to defend against that threat. Meanwhile, the rail crossing would occur at Rheinberg against lighter opposition. Shillstone's company arrived at the Viersen area on the night of March 17th. They had 72 hours to create a complete divisional presence. Tanks, artillery, trucks, command posts, logistics dumps, the full signature of 2 infantry divisions preparing for river assault operations. Shillstone and 15 other soldiers were assigned to create an armored battalion. 20 inflatable Sherman tanks, 10 rubber half-tracks, 5 canvas trucks. They worked through the night, inflating equipment, positioning vehicles, creating tire tracks and footpaths, setting up a realistic tank park. By dawn on March 18th, German observers across the Rhine could see what appeared to be significant American armor concentration near Viersen. Throughout the day, Ghost Army soldiers moved around the equipment, simulating maintenance and preparation activity. At night, sound trucks played recordings of tank engines and tracked vehicle movements. Radio operators broadcast traffic consistent with 2 infantry divisions coordinating with attached armor for river crossing operations. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Viersen area on March 19th. Analysts identified American tank and artillery concentrations. Ground observers reported vehicle movements and construction activity. German intelligence updated their assessments. Americans were preparing major crossing attempt at Viersen. German 15th Army headquarters ordered reserves to move north. 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments and 1 artillery battalion repositioned to defend the Viersen sector. On the night of March 22nd, the Real American crossing began at Rheinberg. The 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, which Germans believed were at Viersen, were actually 10 miles south, crossing the Rhine against surprised German defenders. The German reserves that should have reinforced Rheinberg were at Viersen, preparing to fight American divisions that didn't exist. By the time Germans realized their mistake, American forces had established bridgeheads across the Rhine. The deception had worked perfectly. The Ghost Army maintained the Viersen deception for another 24 hours after the Rheinberg crossing, keeping German reserves tied down while real American forces expanded their bridgehead. Only on March 24th did the 23rd deflate their equipment and withdraw. They left behind empty fields where Germans had believed 30,000 Americans were concentrated. German after-action reports from March 1945, captured after the war, confirmed the deception's effectiveness. A report from the 15th Army dated March 23rd stated, American forces observed concentrating near Viersen have not attacked as expected. Actual crossing occurred at Rheinberg. Our reserves were malpositioned. Intelligence assessment was incorrect. The Germans never realized they'd been fooled by inflatable equipment and radio deception. They believed their reconnaissance had been accurate, but their interpretation had been wrong. The success of Operation Viersen was typical of Ghost Army operations. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the 23rd conducted 21 major deception operations, each lasting 3 to 6 days. They simulated over 30,000 men in phantom formations, created the illusion of multiple divisions, and helped mislead German intelligence consistently. The unit's effectiveness came from combining multiple deception methods: visual inflatable equipment, audio, sound effects, and electronic radio traffic. Each method reinforced the others, creating comprehensive illusions. The soldiers of the 23rd were unusual in military terms. Many were artists recruited specifically for their visual skills. Shillstone had been a commercial illustrator in New York. Other Ghost Army members included fashion designers, stage set builders, advertising artists, and architects. They brought creative thinking to military problems. When asked to make a field look like it housed a tank battalion, they didn't just place inflatable tanks randomly. They studied real tank battalions, observed how equipment was positioned, noted where patterns appeared, understood how units actually looked from above. Their deceptions were convincing because they were based on careful observation of reality. The risks the Ghost Army faced were often understated in later accounts. Operating inflatable equipment near German lines wasn't safe. German artillery fired on positions the 23rd created, destroying equipment and sometimes injuring soldiers. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army operated within miles of German advances. If German armor had overrun their positions, the lightly armed deception troops would have been in serious danger. But the 23 RD's mission required them to operate forward, where Germans could observe their fake equipment. They couldn't deceive from safe rear areas. The unit suffered casualties, though fewer than combat infantry units. 3 soldiers were killed by German artillery fire during operations. 12 were wounded by shell fragments. Several vehicles were destroyed by German fire. But compared to the casualties saved by successful deceptions, the Ghost Army's losses were minimal. If Operation Viersen alone prevented 500 American casualties by diverting German reserves away from the real Rhine crossing, the cost-benefit was favorable. The psychological impact on Germans who eventually realized they'd been fooled is difficult to measure, but probably significant. German intelligence officers, who'd made decisions based on observations of Ghost Army deceptions, had to confront that their professional assessments had been wrong. German commanders, who'd repositioned reserves to counter phantom threats, had to explain why real American attacks succeeded elsewhere. The cumulative effect was to make Germans doubt their intelligence assessments, which created uncertainty and hesitation in decision-making. Post-war interrogations of German intelligence officers revealed that they'd identified numerous American units based on observations that were actually Ghost Army deceptions. A German intelligence officer captured in April 1945 had maps showing American dispositions that included 3 divisions that were completely fictional, created by ghost army operations. The officer insisted his observations had been correct, that the units had been real. He couldn't accept that he'd been systematically deceived for months. The British used similar deception tactics with their Air Force and other units, and coordinated with American deception operations. Combined Allied deception in 1944-45 created such confusion in German intelligence that German commanders were never certain where attacks would actually occur. This uncertainty paralyzed German decision-making and prevented effective use of reserves. Deception became force multiplication. Phantom divisions tied down real German forces without requiring actual American combat power. Arthur Shilstone survived the war and returned to New York in August 1945. He resumed his career as a commercial artist and illustrator, eventually becoming well known for his work in advertising and editorial illustration. He rarely discussed his ghost army service, partly because it remained classified until 1996, partly because it seemed irrelevant to his civilian career. When the Ghost Army story was finally declassified and publicized, Shilstone was 75 years old, retired, and surprised that anyone cared about inflatable tanks from 50 years earlier. In a 1998 interview, Shilstone described Ghost Army operations. "We were creating theater, essentially. Stage sets designed to fool an audience that was watching from a distance. The props were rubber and canvas instead of wood, but the principle was the same. Make it look real from the seats that matter. German observers across the Rhine were our audience. If they believed what they saw, we'd succeeded. And they usually believed." The interviewer asked how Shilstone felt about deceiving the enemy. Shilstone said, "I felt good about it. We were saving American lives without killing Germans. Our inflatable tanks pulled German reserves away from real attacks. That meant Americans faced lighter opposition. That meant fewer Americans died. I'd rather inflate rubber tanks than carry a rifle into combat. The outcome for the war was the same, but the cost in lives was lower." Other Ghost Army veterans expressed similar sentiments. The unit's artist soldiers saw their deception work as a valid form of warfare, perhaps more humane than direct combat. They were defeating the enemy through illusion rather than violence. The rubber tanks and radio traffic achieved military objectives without the casualties that conventional attacks required. From a purely practical standpoint, deception was an efficient use of military resources. The Ghost Army's equipment after the war was mostly destroyed or discarded. Inflatable tanks, being rubber and canvas, deteriorated quickly and had no post-war value. A few examples were saved for military museums. Today, the National World War II Museum has one inflatable Sherman tank on display, donated by a Ghost Army veteran. The tank, deflated and mounted on a wall, looks flimsy and obviously fake. Museum visitors are often surprised that Germans were fooled by such equipment. But the display doesn't show how the tank looked from 400 yards away through binoculars, or how it appeared in aerial reconnaissance photographs. Context matters for deception. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was deactivated in September 1945. Most personnel returned to civilian life. A few stayed in the Army and worked on deception planning during the Cold War, though on a much smaller scale. The techniques the Ghost Army developed influenced military deception doctrine for decades. Modern military deception still uses the same basic principles. Create multiple false indicators that reinforce each other, make the deception appear authentic to the sensors the enemy uses, and coordinate deception with real operations to maximize impact. The Ghost Army story remained classified until 1996, when the Pentagon declassified documents related to their operations. The delay was partly bureaucratic inertia, partly concern that revealing deception techniques might compromise future operations. But by the 1990s, military deception had evolved far beyond inflatable tanks. Modern deception uses electronic warfare, cyber operations, and sophisticated information operations. The Ghost Army's rubber tanks were history, interesting but obsolete. Rick Bayer, a filmmaker, produced a documentary about the Ghost Army in 2013, bringing the story to wider public attention. The documentary featured interviews with surviving veterans, showed archival footage and photographs, and explained the unit's operations. For many viewers, the Ghost Army story was completely unknown. The idea that the U.S. Army had a unit of artists creating theatrical deceptions was surprising. That those deceptions had significantly influenced the war's outcome was even more remarkable. The documentary generated renewed interest in Ghost Army history. Historians researched their operations in more detail, analyzed their effectiveness, and assessed their contribution to Allied victory. The consensus was that the 23 RD's deceptions had been valuable, possibly saving thousands of American casualties by causing German misallocation of forces. Exact casualty figures prevented by deception were impossible to calculate, but the strategic impact was clear. In 2022, Congress passed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Ghost Army, recognizing their unique contribution to the war effort. By that time, fewer than 10 Ghost Army veterans were still alive. The legislation noted that the unit's innovative deception tactics saved countless American lives and contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe. The medal ceremony in 2024 was attended by families of deceased Ghost Army members and representatives of the few surviving veterans. Arthur Shillstone died in 2004 at age 83. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his career as an illustrator and noted briefly that he'd served in a classified Army unit during World War II. By 2004, the Ghost Army story was public, but Shillstone hadn't actively promoted his service. His art career was his primary identity. The inflatable tanks were an interesting footnote, something he'd done during the war, but not the defining experience of his life. Shillstone's family donated his Ghost Army materials to the National Archives after his death. Photographs he'd taken of inflatable equipment, sketches he'd made during operations, letters describing deception missions in careful language that avoided classified details. The materials provided historians with additional insight into how Ghost Army operations actually worked at the soldier level. Shillstone's photographs showed inflatable tanks from multiple angles, demonstrating how convincing they looked under operational conditions. The Ghost Army story has become more widely known in recent years, featured in books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and educational materials. The story appeals because it shows an unusual side of warfare: deception instead of combat, creativity instead of firepower, artists instead of warriors. The image of soldiers inflating rubber tanks to fool the enemy is compelling, almost humorous, but the underlying reality was serious. The deceptions worked. Germans were fooled. American attacks succeeded with fewer casualties because German forces were malpositioned. The estimate that Ghost Army deceptions saved American lives is based on analysis of their operation's strategic impact. Operation Viersen diverted German reserves from the Rhine crossing, possibly preventing hundreds of American casualties. Similar deceptions before other operations had similar effects. Cumulative over 21 operations, the Ghost Army's contribution to reducing American casualties was likely significant, perhaps in the thousands. This is speculative but defensible analysis based on known German force dispositions and Allied casualty rates in similar operations without deception support. The fake tank trick wasn't really a trick in the sense of fooling someone once with a clever gimmick. It was a systematic deception campaign using multiple techniques coordinated over extended periods. The inflatable tanks were one element, supported by radio deception, sound effects, and visual theatrics. The success came from comprehensive execution, attention to detail, and consistent maintenance of illusions over days. Germans weren't fooled by a single rubber tank seen briefly. They were fooled by complete operational pictures built from multiple sources of intelligence that all pointed to the same false conclusion. The title made the Germans run for their lives is somewhat hyperbolic for documentary purposes, but contains truth. Germans did reposition forces, sometimes rapidly, based on Ghost Army deceptions. German reserves ran to counter phantom threats that didn't exist. In that sense, fake inflatable tanks did make Germans move, deploy, and commit forces based on false information. The rubber tanks, though obviously fake up close, were strategically real in their effects. There are thousands of stories from World War II that haven't been told or recognized, so it's our duty to share them somehow. The Ghost Army story was suppressed for 50 years by classification, then gradually revealed. It shows that warfare involves more than combat, that deception can be as effective as firepower, that creativity has military value. The artists and engineers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops fought with inflatable rubber instead of steel, with radio signals instead of bullets, with imagination instead of violence. And they won. Their phantom divisions fooled German intelligence. Their fake equipment drew German forces away from real attacks, and their deceptions saved American lives. That contribution deserves recognition, even if it came from rubber tanks instead of real ones. Now you know their story too.